I'm going to be bringing on analysts, experts to discuss mostly the Middle East. We're going to be discussing the Israel-Hamas war, and of course, we're going to be discussing Iran. That's been an ever important topic, especially as it relates to the Israel-Hamas war. I do want to pull up a tweet really quick from Matt Miller. He is the spokesperson for the U.S. State Department. The United States on Thursday issued further sanctions on Iran, targeting Iranian drones, including their use by Russia in the war in Ukraine, as Washington seeks to ratchet up pressure on Tehran. The U.S. Treasury Department, in a statement, said the action, which is taken in coordination with the United Kingdom and Canada, targets over 12 entities, individuals, and vessels that it accuses of playing a key role in facilitating and financing the sale of military equipment to Iran. To discuss this, we bring in the political director of the Organization of Iranian American Communities, Dr. Majid Sadeghpour. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, I know sanctions are a complex topic. Obviously, the U.S. is not sanctioning Iran directly. The way that the West sanctions Iran, you know, they go kind of in an indirect way to make this happen. How do they make it happen?
Well, sanctions are a way for some to help change the behavior of the other. Relative to Iran, certainly the legislation that just passed the House and bipartisan members of Congress from both the Senate and the House passed it and now signed by the President of the United States puts significant sanctions on the regime in Tehran, both in terms of financial pressure, in terms of holding it accountable for crimes against humanity, the 1988 massacre of political prisoners, and certainly on the terrorism front, holding it accountable as well. But sanctions, as we know, have limits. So first of all, I want to make sure I thank Chairman McCall and bipartisan members of Congress from bringing this legislation forth and passing it. I think it is a significant step in helping change the paradigm on how Iran policy is approached. But as I was saying at the outset, sanctions have limitations. On Iran specifically, we have had a void in policy towards Iran. Pressure is helpful in weakening this regime, and these sanctions help a bleeding regime, a regime that is still trying to recover from the Mahsa Amini uprising that began in September of 2022, and right now is only in power through the barrel of a gun, executing on average 3.5 persons in Iran every day. And so it is important that we look at the policy void. We look at how this policy void must be filled, and the desire of the Iranian people to change the paradigm, meaning that the Iranian people for 4 decades now have been wanting to change this regime in its entirety. But the free world, unfortunately, has been trying to change the regime's behavior. But that paradigm, like I said, is changing. I pointed to Mr. McCall's resolution, and certainly with additional measures in Congress underway now. I point to a House Resolution 1148 that was just introduced last week, latter part of last week. This resolution doesn't just look at sanctions. It outlines what the regime does wrong, but looks to the future as to the actual solutions, because sanctions will not bring this regime or mitigate the threat permanently. The only solution is to actually listen to the Iranian people and support their desire for what we consider the solution on Iran, which is regime change.
I want to ask about the nuts and bolts of these sanctions, because obviously when we hear about sanctions against Iran, we think of Middle East relations. We think of the Israel-Hamas war, but there's a Ukraine-Russia connection to these sanctions as well, correct?
That is correct. And unfortunately, at the center of it all is the Islamic Republic. They have, for 4 decades, have thrived in sowing conflict, terrorizing the Iranian people, and later terrorizing the region and now the greater community in the entirety, including Ukraine. And so I'll get back to the solution that we have to get rid of this regime, but that solution that is one that resides in the Iranian people's aspirations. Iranian people, unlike other nations who want to change the ruling regime, have an organized resistance. The House Resolution 1148 goes into it in detail. Iranian resistance is led by the National Council of Resistance of Iran that has, and Madam Rajavi's 10-point plan for a future Iran is a Jeffersonian plan that demonstrates the Iranian people's call for regime change must be supported for us to mitigate the threat from the regime in Tehran. So to answer your question, political and moral support, in addition to sanctions, is what the international community must offer the Iranian people. Sanctioning the regime and offering political and moral support to the Iranian people.
So this is another curious thing to me. I'll pull up this tweet full screen here. The U.S. Treasury said that it targeted Sahara Thunder, accusing it of being a main front company that oversees commercial activities in support of the IRGC and Russia's war in Ukraine. What is Sahara Thunder?
Well, the Ayatollahs in Iran have created many front companies. If we sanction, if our goal is to put away the symptoms, but ignoring the head of the snake in Tehran, we are missing the point. We are sanctioning individual organizations. We are sanctioning or going after individual terror groups. We are closing shops of some of these organizations that are related to Iran, but for some reason, we have ignored the Ayatollahs themselves and the calls of the Iranian people for wholesale change in Iran. So I want to again point to members of Congress and bipartisan members of Congress. That's the good news. That the United States policy is shifting towards supporting the Iranian people's desire for democratic regime change. And these sanctions will be necessary when Iran is a bright democratic republic where no longer we have to deal with single-party rules of either the monarchy or the single-party theocracy of the Ayatollahs.
And I do want to talk a little bit about Mossad. This is a tweet from the Times of Israel saying a former head of Mossad's economic warfare unit, Yudi Levy, told the Times of Israel that Iran very well could have a global financial network to bypass sanctions. Is that the case, Majid?
As I mentioned earlier, sanctions have limitations, and as we saw, the significant sanctions that we have put on the regime in Tehran has thus far failed to change their behavior, and they are obviously very good at creating front companies and ways to avoid sanctions. And so I can't speak to a specific example you provided there, but I can speak to the fact that Ayatollahs will find a way to blackmail the international community. And our solution, congressional solution really, is to support the people of Iran.
Let's talk about how these sanctions could impact Iran's proxies. How could they impact the proxies? What type of sanctions? When we talk about sanctions on Iran, are we basically also talking about sanctions on the proxies as a whole?
Yes, of course. But most all of these sanctions are, the regime in Tehran is literally running Hezbollah. Hezbollah is really the IRGC itself. When we're talking about sanctioning the regime in Tehran, we by definition are curtailing their terrorist activities abroad, which includes those proxies. So yes, Mr. McCall's resolution does help significantly in weakening the regime. Our assertion, our community that's working across this country with our lawmakers, the victory for our community is that Mr. McCall's resolution has come to pass. The victory for democracy is that Iran is more isolated. The victory for global democracy is that the people of Iran are boots on the ground and are willing to fight and sacrifice to get rid of this regime. And the weaker they become through these sanctions, the easier their job will be. But we have to cross the threshold. We have to offer them political and moral support. Hence, the provisions as specified in House Resolution 1148 become significant.
Does it feel like these sanctions are a direct response to Iran's attack on Israel, or do you feel like these types of sanctions would have already been in the cards regardless?
Well, I think a lot of sanctions Congress had already passed and they were not necessarily being enforced. Unfortunately, what has happened, we saw an escalation in Iran's behavior. Appeasement, unfortunately, begets more predatory behavior from the predators. And so what we saw in Iran's behavior over the past 8 months or so should be correlated with what happened inside Iran. Since October 7th, for example, nearly 600 people have been executed. Over the past 2 weeks, 39 people were executed. Like I mentioned earlier, 3.5% persons per day are being killed. Those things are related. This is an unstable regime that is not able to manage the country or remain in power without killing. And so in order to distract the international community, in order to blackmail the international policymakers, it is engaging in regional warfare. And that warfare will continue to escalate for as long as this regime is in power. Sanctions are limited. Sanctions effectiveness is limited. We have to change this regime, and the Iranian people and their organized resistance, led by the National Council of Resistance of Iran, is the solution. Those kids in the streets of Iran are following a blueprint of 4 decades of resistance against this dictatorship. They deserve our support, our moral and political support. They're not asking for money. They're not asking for weapons. Neither is necessary. But America must dispense with the most powerful weapon it has in its disposal, which is its moral authority, which is its democracy. That we must dispense with, and we must afford the Iranian people that legitimacy to take on this regime. They're willing to do so. They're already sacrificing it every day. Those executions attest to it. We should not be distracted by regimes' distractory behavior in the Middle East. We should limit the activities of those terror groups. We should sanction the regime and weaken it. But our key to unlock this mystery and get rid of this regime lies with the Iranian people. And we must support their desire for regime change. Democratic regime change, not from afar, but from within.
All right, Dr. Majid Sadeghpour, we appreciate your time tonight. Thanks for staying up late. Take care.